relation. Oops. Okay. Chris? Sorry about that.
I apologize, I forgot to start that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that we have tremendous amounts of evidence about the impact of parental trauma on the emotional and relational experiences of children of survivors with their families, with their parents, there's very, very little that speaks about the sibling relationships within this group, or how the characteristics of communication in the family and of Holocaust families' way of being, how might those have impacted the relationships between siblings. And based on my many years of working with Holocaust survivors and their families, I propose that there are actually certain patterns that I see repeatedly and much more frequently than I've seen them in my work with other groups of and other populations. I think that there are certain patterns of trauma-related ways of or dynamics in the family that end up in creating tremendous resentments between siblings, and oftentimes end up in cutoffs in relationships between the siblings, which really tragically repeat or reenact the loss of the extended family that was such a painful aspect in the lives of the second generation, because we had no uncles, no aunts, very few or very few, and very few cousins, and mostly no grandparents, and so forth. So let me explain a little bit more about how I think that happens. What we see in general literature about sibling relationships, which also, while it's been growing over the last few decades, speaking of the development of psychology and psychological research, relative to the enormous emphasis on the relationship between parents and children, there's been a much less focus on the relationships among siblings. And that's actually curious, because while the relationship with siblings are very, very important to those of us who have siblings, and many of us in the United States, in England, in Israel, grow up in families with siblings, that has not really been such a researched area. And it's also interesting because it's actually the potentially longest family relationship that people can have is with their siblings, because we don't have our parents for the rest of our lives, and we won't have our children for all of the earlier part of our life. So our siblings are potentially there for the longest period. It's a very meaningful relationship that has been relatively neglected, in short. And I happen to fall upon the art of this artist, Valerio Berruti, Italian artist, who draws these phenomenal drawings with these simple lines. And these two drawings about sibling relationships, for me, show very much what we see in studies about the impact of trauma in the family on the relationships between siblings. Parental trauma that detracts from the parents' availability or emotional availability to their children leads to either an incredibly intensified closeness between the siblings, where they actually provide each other with a lot of the emotional nurturance that they don't get from the parents who suffer from PTSD or other post-traumatic reactions, or it separates the siblings and creates these tensions and resentments that I spoke about earlier. And those are, of course, the problematic dynamics that I will focus on today, not so much how it makes siblings closer, but how it separates siblings and makes the relationships less good. So in general, in every family, differentiation between siblings, meaning becoming different from my brother and from my sister, and de-identification, meaning I'm my own person and I do things differently, I'm better at different things, I'm different, is a very natural normative process in all families. And what I am claiming is that this normative process is polarized and accentuated among siblings in some Holocaust families because of the very acute perception and sensitivity of children to what the parents went through, to the parents' suffering, to the parents' vulnerabilities, and the very, very strong common need expressed by children of survivors to protect the parents. As a result of that, what we see is that each sibling adapted to the stress of parental persistent trauma symptoms, to the parental anxiety, to the parental losses, and to parental expectations in different ways. And those different ways, so if one, I will say more about it, but for now, I'll say that these different ways create tremendous resentments and conflicts because each of them feels that their way is the right way to protect the parent from further pain. Their way is the one that is the correct one, while the other person's way is not. The other person is inconsiderate. The other person is causing the parents pain and anxiety and in various ways. And because everything in our families is also somehow also colored by the presence of survival and death issues in the family atmosphere, statements such as, my sister is killing them, my brother is driving them into an early grave, are very common, and they're not really stated as metaphors. They're very literally and concretely meant. The feeling is that these survivors' parents went through so much, they're so vulnerable, they're so, in some ways, very resilient, but very emotionally vulnerable in some ways, and my sibling is doing such and such, and that's just literally killing them. And that seems to be such a grave offense in families of survivors who went through so much that it creates very, very serious mutual resentments and criticism. I'm going to try to see why the slide, okay. So the other thing that might happen in families of Holocaust very frequently is, I think we heard a little bit, both in the previous lectures, I tried to touch upon the fact that communication was not very open in families of Holocaust for a variety of reasons. And in our panel discussion, we also heard from the other panelists some other perspectives that also spoke to the difficulty in families of survivors of various catastrophes to speak openly, to have an open communication intergenerationally. And therefore, what happens is often when the parents are angry at one sibling, they will speak about what hurts them and what offends them, and they will be very upset about it, but they will either speak about it to the other sibling, not to the offending sibling, because it's very hard in some Holocaust families to speak openly about negative feelings and to work them out in the relationship openly. So the parent will talk about one child who offended them to the other child, thereby doing what I called here, depositing their negative feelings and their pain in the child that's listening to them. Now, parents are much more likely to have, first of all, a more adult view of things. Second, they are the parents. They're more likely to balance their hurt, their momentary disappointment with the love that they have for all of their children. But a sibling who's much younger has much less capacity to see the bigger picture, much less capacity to be as tolerant towards the other sibling, that sibling might be left with a much more one-sided negative view of how offended and hurt and suffering the parent was because of what the other sibling did and how terrible that sibling is for doing so. So, and the other thing is, in some families, as I said, parents who suffer from some post-traumatic reactions can have difficulties regulating themselves. So while there is still a difficulty communicating openly about feelings in the appropriate way, in an emotionally regulated way, and speak about what offended me and why I felt this way and why might you have done this and how can we sort it out, there is also often dysregulated emotional reactions, overreactivity that's driven by the features of post-traumatic stress, and the symptoms of, irritability and high arousability and all of those things. So people can fly off the handle in a very angry way when one sibling upset them. And if that happens in view of the other sibling, it's a very powerful, emotionally impressive, dramatic moment of just how angry the parent is. And that too can deposit a very dramatic impression in the child who witnesses it about how terrible the other sibling must be for having caused such a reaction. And if we have time, I will get back to you to describe to you one example in particular. So many times, for the parents' sake, the adult siblings, even though they have a very distant, very strained, or even hostile relationship, they maintain the relationship for the parents' sake. Now, when I say about the differences between the siblings, let me add here a little bit. The differences are often such that one person, let's say, oftentimes it's also divided by gender lines. If there are different genders in the siblings, then oftentimes you see the son who left, went further away to a college away or got a job that took him away, is very successful, is very busy, can't come to visit quite as often, and is having a very successful life further away. And a daughter who stayed closer by, who's taking care of the parents more closely, who maybe gave up on her wish to go to a college far away and went to a college nearby in order to stay closer, who maybe didn't take a job that took her to the other side of this great country in order to stay nearby the parents. And what happens is that there are differences in the style of adaptation of these children in many, many aspects, not only in the life choices that they made in these ways, in the relationship that they have with their parents, and in their general choices in life. Now, the one that went away oftentimes feels that the person who stayed close by, they don't respect them as much. They feel they didn't make as much of their lives. They don't respect the fact that they didn't develop a career. By the way, also, as I mentioned to you, a living life very intertwined with the survivor parents was often associated with also conflicts and tensions in that person's own marriage, that sibling's marriage, because he or she, and it tended to be a she more often than he, but he or she felt very, very connected with the parents and very obligated to them. And it often created the tension between the obligations to one's own family and one's own marital relationships and the relationship with the parents and the obligations towards the parents. So this is the sibling who often has a less successful marriage, a less successful career, but is taking care of the parents. The other one who left and is further away has often a more successful personal life and a more successful marriage, and they look down at this person, or they also feel sometimes that this person is depleting the parents by being too open about the problems in their lives and the issues that they share with the parents. Why are they sharing with them all their problems? Because this person who went further away was also from a very young age often the child of survivor who did not share things with their parents, did not share with the parents any of our usual normative trials and tribulations growing up, conflicts with friends, issues. This is the child who tried to hide it from the parents so as not to give them any cause for worry, and also to protect oneself from the parents' intrusive, overreactive anxiety and worries. So these are the children who sort of shielded their privacy and developed a greater level of autonomy, but also distanced themselves more from the parents. And so the one who stayed close by, indeed, this blames that one, the one who went further away, for having abandoned the parents, abandoned the sibling for the care of the parents, having been emotionally less available and less involved and less caring. So what happens is that these resentments many times are sort of hidden to some extent for the sake of the parents, as long as the parents are alive. But when the parents pass away, these adult siblings don't maintain their relationships, and we see a lot of cutoffs between the siblings. And since this is a very large country, if your sibling raises their family in Colorado and you live in New York or California and I don't know where, and you don't actually want to meet and you don't want to spend leisure time together and visit and spend vacations together, then it's very quickly going to be a situation where the children, the third generation that is, practically have no connection with their cousins. They have practically no extended family relationships, which is really, in a way, a reenactment on the larger scale on the cultural scale of Holocaust families. It's a reenactment of the loss of the extended family that the second generation suffered because of the Holocaust. And I quoted here a sentence that was so poignant. I was sitting in the house of a survivor and interviewing her for a study that I completed 2 years ago about the child survivors and their experiences in the United States in the early years after the end of the war. And we were talking about all of these tragic things that happened to her. And then there was a knock on the door, and I hear a man asking, "Are you alone?" And she says, "Yes," which surprised me because I was sitting there. But really what happened was the man, who was one of her sons, one of her two sons, walked in towards the back of the house where his father was, who was not well. And she said to me, "You know, did you hear him? If I had told him that his brother is here, he wouldn't have set foot into the home." And she said, "The biggest tragedy of my life is that my two sons don't speak to each other." And that's from a Holocaust survivor. It was extremely painful to hear. So how does that happen? So first of all, we know that PTSD symptoms, and in particular, the hyperarousal, the overreactivity, the emotional lability, and on the other hand, the emotional detachment and the numbness are two features of post-traumatic reactions that we saw in many different populations, both survivors of military trauma and civilians, to detract from the emotional intimacy in family relationships, both in the spousal unit and in the intergenerational relationships. Now, it may seem contradictory to say hyperarousal on one hand and detachment on the other hand, but as many of you know, hyperarousal has to do with all of that startle response and the quick flying off the handle or getting very anxious very quickly. All of these hyper-aroused symptoms that characterize people with high levels of chronic anxiety and are part of the PTSD picture. And detachment, on the other hand, is something that is also part of the very same picture presented by people with PTSD often, but it has to do with the ability to feel fully engaged and fully, excited about good things in life, to be fully into the happy moments, to feel well-being and to feel connection with people when things are okay, not when you need to operate from your survival mode, but when you actually can relax and enjoy yourself. This is where people become detached sometimes and feel like they're not fully able to connect. The example that I often give for that is the story of my one of my patients who said, I live the life of the American dream. I have a beautiful home in the suburb. I have a decent marriage. I have my 2 kids. I have a car. I come to my parents, the survivors who live in Brooklyn, and I say, I will get you with the car to come to my home on the weekend. You will come, you will have a nice time. I will drive you there. It will be comfortable. We'll have a nice time for the weekend. I'll drive you back home. And they say to me, nah, I don't know. We don't feel so good. We don't know if we have the koyach, if we have the strength. We'll see. And they push me off. And then I hear that the very next week, she says, these 2 same parents who are so unwell and didn't have the strength to be driven to my home to spend a nice weekend in the suburbs, schlepped themselves, which means dragged themselves, on public transportation with pots full of cooked food to my sister on Long Island because she has a terrible marriage and a terrible life, and they need to go rescue her. For that, they have the strength. And this shows you the difference between how survivors can mobilize their resilience, their hardening, master the strength to do things that are very difficult in the purpose of saving the child who has a problem, but their detachment, their emotional detachment and inability to engage and to enjoy when the other child asks them to come and to engage with her family, with her children, when there's no stress and no need to save anybody, but rather to connect. So we know that moments of dysregulation are very, very powerful in our memory. We remember, we are impressed very much by moments when we see somebody very upset, much more than by regular moments when everything is nice and calm and normal. And those moments in family interactions, whether they happen between the parent and oneself or the parent and another sibling, are very, very powerful in our memory. We register them very much and we remember them very much. And I wanted to share with you what we call a disorganizing experience. So these moments are what we consider to be disorganizing experiences in the psychology of the child of survivors. And while we look at families of Holocaust survivors and other trauma families, and we find that actually, let me take a step and just stay with this for a minute and actually read to you the examples. So Jay reported to me that her father calls her. She had a very close relationship with her father. Her sister, who was divorced, was living with the parents and together with her child, and it was going very badly there. And the relationship between the father and the mother has always been very problematic, and the real coalition has always been between Jay and her father. And so she says, he calls me, the survivor father, incredibly upset, complaining about my mother, how he never should have married her. We have nothing in common, he says. It's only a marriage on paper. I wish I could erase it. Same as he used to tell me all those years ago. I'm the savior, and I'm betraying him, she says about herself, because she's married and she's living in her own home. There is no one to care about me. You care about me. Why aren't you here? He says to her. But also, he says to her, when she says, I'll come, no, no, don't come. You have your own life. Stay, don't come. You take care of your own life. As Jay explained, I was so depressed, she said, when I got off the phone. I'm trying to figure out my marriage, which was not exactly peachy, but she was working on it. How to be a mother. What does he want from my life? All three of them are lost. She's talking about her father, her mother, and her sister who are living together now in this home. I'm not strong enough to deal with it. I can't do it. This is the reason why I can't. I don't have the right. They're in me. If I'm a part of them, how can I be normal? How can I have a life? I don't belong with the living. At the end of the phone call, he said, I feel better now. I love you. And I felt so sick, dazed, and depressed. So here you see the depositing of the negative feelings, as I talked about earlier. You see also the impact of the disorganizing impact psychologically on her. Her father felt better at the end of the phone. She felt sick, dazed, and depressed. So what we also talked about in the previous presentations, for those of you who are with us, is that in families of Holocaust survivors, there's an overarching common characteristic that second generation report all over the world in repeated and large samples, the manifestation of a unique experience which has to do with needing to protect the parents and needing to somehow make things better for them because of everything that they went through. And somehow people feel imbued with very special and very heavy missions to make up for everything the parents lost, to make up for and achieve everything that the parents couldn't achieve because their education and their possibilities were taken away from them. And then they were poor immigrants in a different country and couldn't make it up. All kinds of missions that have to do with making up for a catastrophic genocidal trauma, which of course is a mission that no child can actually fulfill. So it makes it very difficult to feel like the child who fulfills their obligations towards their parents. And so, oops, just 1 second, sorry. And so for those of you who weren't with us before, I'll read again this tiny little quote from a book of essays by Sandra Hortis, where she says, the essays in this collection were written after I'd begun pondering a divide in myself, one separating me into two selves, a daughter of Holocaust survivors and an average liberated American woman. Born in 1950 in Brooklyn, I was, at least on paper, American. But even as a young girl, I understood that being American meant being lighter and freer than I often felt. I was painfully self-conscious child, consumed with concern for my family's welfare. And that is something that we see also in other families of trauma-exposed parents, the inordinate concern in the children for the welfare of the parents. So some of the very common preoccupations are to take care of the parent and assume responsibility for the parent's well-being. And adult children of survivors often report that they feel that the parent's emotional availability was either limited or very unpredictable and depended on their state of mind at the moment, which of course you have to remember how hard they work, how difficult was their night time in terms of interrupted sleep and all of that, because of all of the issues of PTSD, post-traumatic reactions, and trying to make a life as an immigrant. So seeing the parent in these ways was very, very, complicated. And what we see is that these overarching concerns for the well-being of the parent and these disorganizing moments in the relationship with the parents did not impact all children of survivors in the same way. So infants vary in temperament, parenting practices range in various families from more optimal to completely psychopathological. Childhood experience that second generation had range from optimal to traumatizing, and the outcomes in the children is consequently very different. We also know that parents within the same family communicated different messages, different relational messages, both implicitly and explicitly to different children. So many times the gender of the child was a very dividing sort of factor in which messages were projected or shared with different children. And oftentimes the son got to hear more of the heroic moments in the parents and the resilient moments in the parents' stories from the Holocaust. And the son got to hear and absorb more of the message of you go get and you achieve and you do. And the daughter got more of the sad stories, the losses, the relational longing, and the implicit or explicit expectation to stay nearby and not abandon the parents. So children, even within the same family of the same parents, have a different relationship with the parent. And we speak about it as the co-construction of the relationship in the parent-child dyad. Every child has a different relationship with the parent. And even if it's the same parent, and even if the siblings come from the same family, we often will have the impression, if we talk to them in depth about their relationship with their parents, and if we look at how they then constructed their lives and their relationship, that they come from different families. The important, another important, very important aspect that has to do not necessarily with gender that differentiated between siblings. Siblings are also, as I said, infants come to the world with different temperaments. They come to the life of the parents at different times. I often emphasize to people that the firstborn to survivor parents has a different experience than the siblings that are born afterwards, after the parents have already healed a lot more and have seen that they can produce a healthy child and have established themselves a little bit better in the place where they immigrated to. So there are factors that differentiate the experience of children within the same family, such as the time when they were born and the gender and the time that elapsed between their birth and the trauma of the parents and how well the parents healed. But there are also individual temperamental differential, which we call differential susceptibility. Children have a differential level of susceptibility to sad things in the family, as well as to positive factors, to vulnerabilities, as well as to protective factors within the family and outside the family, so that something that would be problematic for one child, even for example, one child needs a lot more connection and relatedness with the parent. And for that child, a parent who needs it too will be just fine. For a child who temperamentally needs more autonomy, this kind of parenting would feel very intrusive and very limiting and very uncomfortable, and vice versa. So even things like that, the differential susceptibility of siblings creates a great difference between them in their experience of the family relationship with their parents. And so what we see is that despite the general concern to protect the parents, children, different siblings do it in very different ways. So one child might think that by leaving the home to the great college far away and by taking that amazing job that pays wonderfully and it's very prestigious. They are bringing their parents the nachat, the naches, and the joy to try their best to outbalance the negative experiences that the parents had with as much positive as possible. And that's the child who, like I said before, often says, I don't, doesn't share with the parents even big problems in their lives, such as a heart attack that they had or a cancer treatment, because they don't want to share anything that would hurt the parent. And the other one is the one who stayed by, as I described before. So those things, I need to conclude that part by saying it's very important for us, for our own healing internally, and for the healing of our families, and for the sort of the fabric of relationships as a culture that was exposed to trauma. We have to understand that the one who's killing the parents might not be necessarily, even if it's a really problematic child who comes to the parents with every problem and who needs the parents' assistance, the daughter on Long Island, which needs her parents to drag themselves to her with the cooked food. Maybe it's not the bad child, but the child who actually in many ways responds to the implicit need of the parents to be needed and manages in a paradoxical way to pull for the strength of the parents and for to animate them and to make them feel connected in a way that is very difficult for the other child to do if the other child tries to just make them come and have a good time. So in a way, the problem child manages to enliven the parents and to animate them and to make them feel connected to their strength. And maybe that's something that we need to remember. And there's a lot more that can be said also about the fact that the differentiation between the siblings in terms of personality characteristics, in terms of how they developed relationships with people, is not always just with regards to their family of origin. The one who didn't share anything with their family growing up might be someone who also has difficulties sharing and being really intimate and vulnerable with their spouse or friends and adult children. And they might benefit from taking back a little bit more of those aspects that they so left out of their sense of self and left for their sibling. And the sibling who was so about taking care of the parents might actually benefit from developing a little bit more of their own sense of self and their own sense of having a right to their own needs and their own plans in other relationships, because they also often took that attitude that other people's needs are always more important than their own. They might have also imported that attitude to their relationships in marriage and with adult children and with friends. So at this point in life, sort of mixing it up a little bit, seeing why we did what we did, the context in which such emotional learning took place is very important, not only for perhaps improving some of the way that we feel about our siblings, but also the ways that we allow ourselves to reclaim disown parts of who we are or who we can be. So that's one issue that I wanted to mention that makes it very difficult sometimes for adult children of survivors for the continuation of extended family relationships in our families, which I feel are in danger, and we need to be aware of the fact that even if we can't repair our relationship with our siblings, it's so important to allow our children somehow the opportunity to build relationships with their cousins, because it's a terrible loss to not have that. The other thing that I wanted us to basically talk about also in terms of difficulties is the fact that Holocaust survivors have been seen in various studies that looked at their relationship with healthcare providers as difficult patients. And we have to help people who work with Holocaust survivors. We have to create opportunities for people to gain better understanding of why that is the case. And we do see that training of hospital staff and of medical staff helps them and creates less burnout and less frustration and improves quality of care. We also want to remember, as healthcare providers in the mental health professions and in the medical settings where Holocaust survivors are often in the end brought to as residential facilities, we have to remember all of these issues that characterized the experience of second generation throughout life, the emphasis on caring for the parents, on protecting the parents, how important it is to remember the enormous weight of these concerns as second generation becomes caregivers to parents, and why sometimes the second generation poses such difficulties in their relationship with the parents' caregivers. And they seem to be so demanding or so easily triggered or empathic to the difficulties or the limitations that the care providers, that the healthcare providers are doing their best to deal with. It's very important to remember the context and to be able to respond with understanding, to show understanding of it, and to deal with that not as, oh, this person is just being mean and nasty and entitled and narcissistic, but this person grew up with survivors of trauma and with the imperative that it is their job in life to protect these parents from further pain. I certainly have a lot more to say, but I would like to stop here to allow us a few minutes of questions and comments and interaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Felsen. I do have a couple questions. In connection with the issue that you discussed of cutoffs between siblings, what have you generally found can help repair these relationships? And is there a difference between trying to repair them before parents die or after parents die?
You know, I think that many times it seems that it's actually easier to repair let me put it this way. Sometimes it's easier to repair while the parents are still alive, because there is still this thing that forces siblings to talk with each other, forces them to sometimes even get together with each other, whether it's about the care of the aging parent or things related to it. So sometimes if we have this insight and we can actually try to relate differently to each other, or maybe even bring it up for discussion, depends on who your sibling is, then it's easier. Then after the parent pass away, and if the resentments are so intense, then by that point, sometimes it's very hard to actually get together and do anything differently. On the other hand, I sometimes also observed that things got a little bit less intense, and there was a possibility of hearing each other from a different perspective a little bit, or enjoying each other in a different way once the parents are not anymore there. And that whole obligation and that whole issue over which there were so many differences is gone. So it's a very case-by-case kind of thing. I think what's important is to just be aware of these dynamics as something that might have also contributed very much to the state of the relationship, and not just to see it as simple reality. You know, my sister is a you-know-what, or my brother is a you-know-what, and that's just the way it is. And we see things so differently, and obviously my way is right. So it's...
Well, it reminds me of some comments from the panelists from the last session about once you understand what's behind and you realize it's not really you, it's them, and they're doing the best they can. Right. You can bring that same sense of grace to your perception of your siblings.
Absolutely. And understand even that they're doing their best, and that in a way they were also trying to do and live according to the same imperative that was so important to you. They were also trying to save the parents from pain. They were also trying to be good children in their way, even sometimes by being that needy, problem-causing child who needs to be saved all the time and rescued.
It gives a role to their parent.
That's exactly right. So to understand that they also might have responded to a subset of parental needs in their own way.
Thank you. There's another question someone brought up was, are there any mental illnesses that are more prominent in second generation and third generation?
No. We, as a population, as the large population of children of survivors, which is a large population, it's very varied. And one of the most amazing findings over the many decades since the 70s, we have a large body of knowledge, both clinical and empirical, about the second generation. And the most amazing finding is actually that we don't have a higher frequency of psychological and psychiatric disorders in this population, despite the incredibly traumatic histories of our parents. However, we do have a host of elevated symptoms, elevated scores, not symptoms, elevated scores in a whole host of areas, including higher anxiety, higher tendency towards oppressive experiences, higher mistrustfulness, higher hypervigilance, less good control over aggression, which means some of us have a higher tendency to fly off the handle. Some of us have difficulties being sufficiently assertive when someone hurts them and when they feel angry and offended. We have a whole host of feelings of alienation. We have a whole host of areas in which we differ statistically from peers who are not Holocaust related, but all of our differences remain within, you know, what's considered the whole range that's considered normative and non-clinical. We don't have higher frequency of clinical disorders.
Someone asked if that played out in higher incidence of substance abuse. Would that be one of the?
Not to my best knowledge, no.
Okay. Someone asked if you could speak a little bit more about similarities or differences in families affected by other traumas other than mass genocides or Holocausts.
So there's one thing, I'm very glad for this question. Thank you. And I do have to highlight one aspect that's very important. There is a very important difference between trauma and its transmission and the effects of it in families where the parents were survivors of genocides, Holocaust, things like that, veterans, combat veterans, and families where the trauma of the parents, the trauma that the parents suffered, was inflicted by their own parents. That's a very profoundly different type of a phenomenon. And so, you know, the impact of trauma that is inflicted inside the family upon the child by someone whose own trauma was inflicted by the parents is very, very different. And we see the difference in terms of what types of effects are transmitted, the trauma that is inflicted inside the family by the people that were supposed to protect you and love you, and by the people that a child naturally depends upon and has to continue to depend upon, even if sometimes these are the people that inflict terrible fear and pain upon the child. That kind of trauma is much more likely to be transmitted from generation to generation if it is not addressed appropriately by one generation that will stop its transmission. Genocidal trauma, all of the stuff that we talked about earlier in our two-day meetings, this kind of trauma, the trauma at least specifically in Holocaust families, we did not see transmission of certain things to the second generation. And the explanation was because most of the survivors did have the good opportunity of a few years, even if they were children when the Holocaust started, they did have a few years of reasonably decent relationship with their parents, reasonably good enough parenting before the trauma was inflicted upon them by people from the outside, not by the people that they were supposed to depend upon and love. It's a very different kind of trauma.
Well, I thank you. We have now reached the end of the hour, and I wanted to express our great appreciation for all of the information that you've shared with us over the last 2 days. It has been an amazing group of sessions, and the panelists were fascinating. And thank you so much. And I just want to remind everyone that I will be sending out the CEU certificates as well as evaluation, and would very much appreciate if you would complete the evaluations.
Thank you, Chris. And I just wanted to mention, this is why I scrolled back to this slide, that I will be very happy to provide information and other papers. And of course, if people want me to add them to my blog, where there's a mention of other things that I've done, or videotaped lectures, or notices about other webinars of this sort, you send me an email to my email and I will subscribe you. Thank you very much, Chris, for the opportunity to be with you, and hopefully some other time I will actually get to Minnesota in person.
And you'll find it's a very nice place to visit. So I hope you'll—
heard so. I heard so. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.